The lights go off. The room goes quiet. And in that silence, one question sits heavier than anything either person says out loud. What if the very thing you've been doing to fix this is actually the thing keeping it stuck? Picture a man who's spent years quietly trying to last longer in bed, following every piece of advice the internet hands out, and somehow ending up more anxious, more tense, and further from an answer than when he started. That isn't a rare story. It's closer to the rule than the exception, and by the time this is over, you'll probably understand why. If you've ever typed something like "how to last longer in bed naturally" or "premature ejaculation causes and treatment" into a search bar late at night, you already know what comes back. The same handful of articles, the same advice, recommended with total confidence by people who never stop to ask whether it actually fits your body. Premature ejaculation is one of the most common topics in men's sexual health, and also one of the most misunderstood. Researchers studying male sexual function generally estimate that somewhere between 1 in 5 and 1 in 3 men will experience it at some point in their lives, making it more common than erectile dysfunction, and far more common than most men are willing to say out loud. The strange part isn't how often it happens. It's how rarely anyone actually talks about it, even with a doctor, even with a partner, even with themselves. There's also a popular myth attached to it, the idea that this is mostly a young man's problem, something that fades naturally with age and experience. Large surveys on sexual health tell a different story. It shows up across every age group, including a meaningful share of men in their 60s and 70s, with no clean pattern tied to experience alone. Which means the comforting idea that you'll just grow out of it isn't something to rely on. That kind of silence creates a problem of its own. When something this common gets treated like a private failure instead of an ordinary health topic, men stop searching for real understanding and start searching for a fast fix. And almost everyone lands on the same fast fix. Train the muscle, build control, squeeze harder. It's the advice repeated across forums, fitness channels, and locker room conversations for years. Strengthen the pelvic floor. Do your Kegels. Take charge of your body. Here's the part almost nobody mentions. For a meaningful number of men, that advice is solving the wrong problem entirely. To see why, you have to look past the muscle itself and into the system quietly running underneath it, the nervous system. Every time the body senses pressure, whether that's a tense deadline, a difficult conversation, or the anticipation of sex, it activates the sympathetic nervous system, the body's built-in alarm response. Heart rate climbs, breathing turns short and shallow, and muscles, including the muscles of the pelvic floor, instinctively brace and tighten in the same reflexive way your shoulders creep toward your ears under stress. That detail matters more than it sounds like it should, because the pelvic floor isn't only involved in sexual function. It's a supportive sling of muscle that holds up the bladder and bowel, coordinates closely with the diaphragm during breathing, and plays a direct role in the timing of ejaculation. When those muscles are already tight before anything sexual even begins, the margin for control shrinks. In a sense, the body is already halfway to the finish line before the race has technically started. This is where the popular advice quietly falls apart. Pelvic floor exercises for premature ejaculation are recommended almost everywhere online, and Kegel exercises specifically were designed to strengthen weak pelvic floor muscles, which is genuinely useful for some men. But a growing body of pelvic health research points to something different happening in many premature ejaculation cases. Not weakness, but hypertonicity, a pelvic floor so chronically overactive it struggles to fully release even at rest. Asking an already tense system to contract harder doesn't build control. More often, It shortens the fuse instead of lengthening it. If that sounds familiar, you're not broken, and you're not alone. You may simply have been training the wrong variable. It's worth naming the other common shortcut too, since it's marketed just as heavily. Desensitizing sprays, numbing creams, and thicker condoms built to dull sensation. These products can have a genuine short-term effect for some men, and there's nothing wrong with reaching for one. But they work by reducing feeling rather than calming the underlying nervous system response, which means the tension and the timing pattern tend to return the moment the product isn't used. They manage a symptom in the moment. They don't change what's actually driving it. So how would anyone know whether tension, rather than weakness, is the more relevant piece of their own pattern? Pelvic health specialists often point to a cluster of subtle signs, sometimes grouped together as tight pelvic floor symptoms. A pelvic floor that feels hard to consciously relax, a tight or aching sensation in the perineum, the small stretch of tissue between the scrotum and the anus, a urinary stream that starts and stops without effort, and the detail most men never connect: symptoms that get worse, not better, after weeks of dedicated Kegel training. None of this is a diagnosis on its own. It's a pattern worth noticing, and worth raising with a doctor or a pelvic floor physical therapist if it sounds familiar. What makes this pattern so persistent is that it rarely stays contained to the bedroom. A tense moment leads to finishing sooner than wanted, which leads to embarrassment, which leads to anticipating failure the next time, which puts the nervous system on high alert before anything even begins. Over months or years, that cycle can quietly reshape a man's confidence, his willingness to be intimate, and even his sense of who he is in a relationship. Not because of anything wrong with him as a person, but because stress and arousal travel through the exact same nervous system pathway, and the body doesn't know the difference between performance pressure and any other kind of pressure. There's a relationship layer to this that often gets skipped in these conversations too. Partners frequently sense the tension before it's ever named out loud, a body that feels rigid, a rush that leaves both people a little disconnected, a topic that quietly turns into something nobody brings up. Avoiding the conversation tends to make the underlying anxiety louder, not quieter, while naming it plainly and without shame is often the first real step toward loosening the whole cycle. It isn't a problem one partner is failing at. It's a shared physiological moment that responds far better to patience than to pressure from either side. Lifestyle plays a quieter role in this than most people expect, as well. Hours spent sitting at a desk, in a car, or on a couch compress the hips and pelvis, and can leave the surrounding muscles, including the pelvic floor, sitting in a low-grade state of tension long before anyone gets near a bedroom. Add in poor sleep, heavy caffeine intake, or a general habit of carrying stress in the body, and the pelvic floor essentially never gets a true rest period. None of this is about blame. It's simply a reminder that a symptom that shows up in one specific moment often has roots that reach far wider than that moment alone. So what tends to actually help this particular pattern isn't more contraction, and this is closer to the real answer behind natural ways to last longer in bed than anything sold as an overnight trick. It's deliberate, practiced relaxation, and that idea runs against almost everything men are taught about solving problems with their bodies. It starts with breathing, because breath and the pelvic floor are mechanically linked in a way most people never learn. Inhale fully into the belly rather than the chest, and the diaphragm descends, drawing the pelvic floor down and lengthening it along with it. Exhale, and both rise back together. Chronic stress tends to pull people into shallow, upper chest breathing, which means the pelvic floor rarely gets a real chance to fully release, even overnight. Slow, deliberate belly breathing, sometimes called diaphragmatic breathing, is one of the simplest known ways to interrupt that pattern. From there, many pelvic health practitioners introduce gentle, self-directed pressure work, sometimes using nothing more than a small ball positioned against the perineum while seated. The intention isn't to dig in or force anything. It's closer to a long, patient stretch, using body weight and gravity to ease tension the way you might release a tight calf muscle after a long run. Except this particular muscle group almost never gets that kind of attention. Done slowly, with breath, and entirely without pain, this kind of self-work is sometimes used alongside professional pelvic floor therapy. It isn't a replacement for that care, and it isn't guaranteed to resolve every case. Some specialists also teach what's known as a reverse Kegel, the deliberate opposite of clenching. Rather than pulling the pelvic floor up and in, the movement involves gently bearing down and allowing it to lengthen, similar to the sensation of beginning to urinate, then fully releasing on the way back. It feels unfamiliar to most men, mainly because everything they've been taught about these muscles centers on tightening them, never on practicing how to let them go. But the story here is bigger than one exercise, and bigger than the bedroom entirely. The same bracing response that shows up during sex is the same one the body reaches for every time knuckles whiten around a steering wheel after being cut off in traffic, every time frustration gets swallowed, mid-conversation and a jaw locks instead of speaking, every time a breath gets quietly held at a desk for 3 seconds too long without anyone noticing. For a lot of men, premature ejaculation isn't an isolated malfunction. It's one visible symptom of a nervous system that has spent years staying braced, and the body never built a separate setting for sexual stress versus everyday stress. It runs the same alarm either way. That reframes the entire question. Instead of asking, how do I control this one moment? The more useful question becomes, how does my body generally respond to pressure? And can it learn a different default? That's a slower process than a one-time trick, and a far more honest one. Pausing during an ordinary stressful moment to take a handful of slow breaths, quietly checking whether the shoulders, jaw, or pelvic floor are gripping when they don't need to. It sounds almost too simple to matter. Repeated daily, in moments that have nothing to do with sex, it's what actually shifts a nervous system's baseline over weeks, not minutes. This is also where most men quietly give up, because there's no dramatic before and after here. Changing a long-held tension pattern behaves more like physical therapy than a magic trick, and it asks for patience in a culture that mostly sells overnight fixes. There's no single guarantee either. Every body is different, and the underlying contributors to premature ejaculation can range from performance anxiety and relationship dynamics to other medical factors that deserve real evaluation rather than guesswork. What the current research does consistently point toward is that for men whose pattern is tied to pelvic floor tension and an overactive stress response, learning to relax rather than learning to squeeze harder is genuinely worth exploring. Ideally, alongside a doctor, urologist, or pelvic floor physical therapist who can rule out other causes and tailor the approach to the individual. Maybe the most useful thing to take from any of this has nothing to do with sex at all. It's the idea that the body has been trying to communicate through the part of life that felt the most private and the most shameful to even mention, and that the answer was never about trying harder or gripping tighter. It was about noticing where tension quietly lives and slowly learning how to release it. So the next time your hands tighten on a steering wheel or your shoulders climb toward your ears before a hard conversation, it might be worth pausing, just for one breath, to ask what else has been quietly bracing for impact and whether it's finally time to let it go.